The billionaire called it a test, she called it disrespect. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Now, let us return to our main character. Julia had learned to measure her days in small, careful units. One shift at a time. One receipt folded into her wallet. One promise to herself that tomorrow would be steadier than today. On this particular evening, she stood at the edge of a modest neighborhood cafe, counting the bills in her hand, making sure she could cover dinner without touching the money she had set aside for rent. The air smelled like roasted coffee and warm bread. It should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt like pressure. Across the room sat David. At least, that was the name he gave her. He wore worn jeans and a plain jacket, the kind you buy because it lasts, not because it impresses. When he smiled, it was easy, practiced, like someone who knew how to disappear into a crowd. He told her he had just lost his job. He said it quietly, as if the words were heavier than he expected. He said he did not know what came next. Julia listened. She always did. She asked questions without prying. She nodded without pity. When the server came, David hesitated, eyes flicking to the prices on the menu. Julia noticed. She always noticed. She closed her menu first and ordered something simple, something safe. Then she smiled and said it was on her tonight. She said it like it was nothing, like it did not matter. Inside, it mattered a lot. David watched her hands as she paid. He watched the way she tucked the receipt away, slow and precise, as if the paper itself carried weight. He did not stop her. He did not protest. He did not tell her the truth. In his mind, this was information. This was data. Julia talked about her week, long hours. A manager who promised more shifts and delivered fewer. A dream she never said out loud, except tonight, because something about David felt safe. She said she wanted stability more than anything. Not luxury, not miracles, just ground that did not move beneath her feet. David nodded. He asked gentle questions. He shared a story about sleeping on a friend's couch. He said he hated asking for help. He said he wanted to know who people really were when money was not in the room. Julia laughed, soft and tired. She said money was always in the room, even when no one named it. She said you could feel it in the choices people made, in the pauses before an order, in the silence after a bill arrived. When they stood to leave, the night was cool and the streetlights painted the sidewalk in pale gold. David thanked her. He said tonight meant more than she knew. Julia waved it off, but her shoulders relaxed, just a little, as if kindness had cost her something and given something back at the same time. As they parted, David felt certain. In his world, certainty was power. He believed he had learned what he came to learn. Julia walked home, counting steps, replaying the evening, wondering if being generous had been wise or reckless. She told herself it was neither. It was simply who she was. She did not know she had been measured. She did not know the truth was waiting. Julia did not see David again for 3 days. Not because she did not think about him. She did. More than she wanted to admit. But her life did not pause for unanswered questions or quiet dinners that lingered in memory. It moved forward the way it always did, with early mornings and long hours and the steady hum of responsibility. On the 4th day, he texted. He asked if she wanted to take a walk after her shift. Nothing fancy, just air and conversation. Julia hesitated before answering. She told herself she had no reason to say no. She also told herself she would not pay for anything this time. They met near a small public park, the kind with uneven sidewalks and benches that had seen better years. David arrived early. He always did. He stood when he saw her, like someone who had learned manners long before he learned restraint. They walked side by side, hands in their pockets, steps unhurried. David talked about his past in fragments. Jobs that ended suddenly. Friends who faded when money became tight. He said he was tired of people who only showed up when there was something to gain. Julia listened, but something in her shifted. Not suspicion, awareness. She noticed how carefully he chose his words, how he asked questions that circled around values instead of facts. What would you do if you had more than you needed? What did loyalty look like when it cost something? Who did you trust when things fell apart? It felt less like conversation and more like an interview she had not agreed to. When they stopped at a small food truck, David glanced at the menu and then at the line behind them. He said he was not very hungry. Julia believed him at first. Then she saw it again. That pause, that calculation. She ordered something small for herself. She did not offer to cover his meal. This time, she waited. David smiled and said he was fine. He said he appreciated her honesty. That night, Julia lay awake longer than usual. She replayed his questions, the way his eyes lingered after she answered, as if her words needed to be weighed. She told herself she was imagining things. Still, she slept lightly. The next week, David suggested meeting again, this time at a friend's place where a few people were gathering. He said it was casual, nothing serious. The apartment was modest but clean. The people were friendly, the wine was cheap. Conversation flowed easily until someone asked David what he did before losing his job. He laughed it off and deflected. Someone else asked Julia where she worked. She answered honestly. Later, when a debate started about money and ambition, David turned to Julia and asked, in front of everyone, whether she thought people changed when they became rich. The room went quiet. Julia felt the heat rise in her chest. She answered calmly. She said money did not change people. It revealed them. It gave them permission to be more of who they already were. David watched her closely. Too closely. On the walk home, Julia stopped under a streetlight and turned to face him. She asked him why he kept putting her in these conversations. Why he kept asking questions that felt like tests. David paused. Then he smiled, soft and unreadable, and said he just liked to know who people really were. Julia nodded slowly. She said knowing someone meant trusting them, not studying them. She said she did not like feeling evaluated. David apologized. He said he did not mean it that way. But as they parted, Julia felt something settle in her chest. A quiet certainty. She had been open. She had been honest. And somewhere along the way, the balance between them had shifted. She did not know why yet. She only knew she was being watched. And David, walking alone, believed the test was working. By the second week, Julia stopped telling herself she was imagining things. David was still kind, still attentive, still careful. But there was a rhythm to their time together now, and Julia could feel it pressing against her skin. Every meeting seemed to arrive with a quiet challenge attached, as if something unseen was being placed in front of her to see how she would respond. One evening, David showed up late. They had agreed to meet near the cafe where Julia worked. She had finished a double shift, her feet aching, her patience thin. When he arrived, he looked unsettled. He told her his friend needed help moving out of an apartment on short notice. He said he had promised to assist, but had forgotten they were supposed to meet. Julia listened. She looked at his face, waiting for the rest of the sentence. The apology. The awareness. It came late, and it came soft. She nodded and said she understood. She said people had obligations. Then she added, just as calmly, that she would not wait next time. David studied her for a moment, surprised. Then he smiled and said he respected that. They walked anyway, past closed shops and quiet intersections. David talked about loyalty again, about sacrifice, about how easy it was to say the right thing when nothing was at stake. Julia stopped walking. She asked him why he kept returning to the same ideas. Why everything seemed to circle around, proving something. She said relationships were not auditions. They were choices. David said nothing at first. Then he said he had been hurt before. He said he learned to be careful. Julia said being careful did not mean being controlling. She said trust did not grow under observation. It grew in freedom. That night, she went home unsettled, but clear. She told herself she would not bend herself smaller to make someone else comfortable. 2 days later, David asked for a favor. He said he had an interview the next morning across town. He said public transportation was unreliable that early. He asked if Julia could drive him. He said he would pay for gas later. Julia hesitated. She thought about her schedule, her early shift, the little sleep she would get. She said yes, anyway. She told herself helping once did not mean creating a pattern. The next morning, she waited in her car as the sky lightened. David arrived right on time. He thanked her more than once. He spoke about nerves, about pressure, about wanting this opportunity to work out. When they reached the building, Julia noticed the address. It was not a small office. It was a tower, glass and steel. The kind of place you noticed even if you had never been inside. David followed her gaze and laughed. He said it was not what it looked like. He said the interview was for a contractor position. Temporary, nothing special. Julia nodded. She wished him luck. She drove away with a strange weight in her chest. That evening, David texted to say the interview went well. He said it felt good to be believed in. Julia read the message twice before responding. She said she was glad for him. What she did not say was that belief should not feel like a transaction. Later that week, Julia overheard a coworker talking about a tech executive named David who had been featured in the news. The name caught her attention. Just for a moment, she dismissed it. Coincidences happened. Still, the feeling returned. The sense that the ground beneath her was being measured. David, meanwhile, sat alone in his apartment, replaying every word, every choice. In his mind, the pattern was forming. Julia was consistent, principled, unimpressed by need. He told himself the test was nearly complete. He did not consider what it would cost when the truth arrived. The invitation arrived on a Thursday morning, quiet and unassuming. David asked if Julia could join him that evening for a small networking event. He said a friend had an extra ticket and could not make it. He said it might help him hear about opportunities. Nothing more. He added, almost casually, that she could say no. Julia stared at the message longer than she meant to. Networking events were not her world. Rooms full of confident voices and polished smiles usually made her feel invisible, but something in his wording felt deliberate, like another door placed carefully in her path. She agreed. The venue was downtown, a converted warehouse with exposed brick and soft lighting. Julia arrived straight from work, her hair still tied back, her shoes sensible and worn. She paused at the entrance, taking in the room, the hum of conversation, the low clink of glasses. David was already inside. He looked different, not richer, not louder, just more at ease. He greeted people by name. He listened without effort. He said she was honest. He said he valued that. As they moved through the room, Julia felt eyes linger, not unkind, but curious. Someone asked where she worked. Someone else asked how she and David met. She answered simply. She did not pretend to belong. Then she heard his name again. Not from him. From across the room, a man laughed and said, almost jokingly, that David always liked to observe before committing. He said David had a habit of watching how people behaved when there was nothing to gain. He said it like it was a compliment. Julia felt the words land slowly. She looked at David. He was smiling, listening, nodding. He did not correct the man. He did not look at her. A quiet clarity settled in her chest. Later, near the edge of the room, Julia asked David what the comment meant. She asked it calmly. She asked it without accusation. David hesitated. Just a fraction too long. He said people revealed themselves over time. He said trust was built on evidence. He said he believed in being thorough. Julia nodded. She said being thorough was different from being deceptive. She said consent mattered, even in observation. David told her she was reading too much into it. The rest of the evening passed in polite motion. When they left, the night air felt colder than it had before. They walked a block in silence. Julia stopped. She told David she did not like feeling like a subject. She told him she had been generous with her time, her honesty, her effort. She said she had not agreed to be evaluated. David tried to reassure her. He said his intentions were good. He said he admired her principles. Julia shook her head. She said admiration without respect was empty. She said she did not need to prove who she was to anyone. They parted without anger, without raised voices. But something had shifted decisively. At home, Julia sat on the edge of her bed and replayed every moment from the beginning. The questions, the pauses, the situations that always seemed to ask more of her than of him. She felt embarrassed, not because she had been kind, but because that kindness had been treated like evidence. Across the city, David stood alone in his apartment, staring out at the lights below. In his mind, the pattern was clear. Julia had passed every test he believed mattered. What he did not see was the cost, because somewhere between observation and control, he had crossed a line. And Julia, finally, knew it. Julia did not answer David's messages the next day. Not out of anger, not out of spite. She simply needed space where her thoughts could breathe without being observed. She went to work, focused on orders and schedules, on the steady rhythm of tasks that did not ask her to explain herself. David noticed the silence immediately. By the second day, he told himself it was normal. People needed time. By the third, the absence felt heavier. He replayed the night at the event again and again, searching for the moment things shifted beyond repair. In his mind, he had not lied about who he was. Not exactly. He had only withheld details. He had believed the difference mattered. On the fourth evening, he showed up at the cafe near closing time. Julia saw him through the front window before he stepped inside. Her shoulders tensed, then settled. She finished wiping down the counter and walked out to meet him instead of inviting him in. David apologized. He did not rush it. He said he had not meant to make her feel examined. He said his past had taught him to be cautious, to look closely before trusting. Julia listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked him a simple question. She asked whether he had ever told her the full truth about his life. David hesitated. Then he said no. The word hung between them. Julia nodded once. She said honesty was not a reward someone earned after passing enough tests. She said it was the starting point. She said when someone decided to study another person without their consent, they turned connection into control. David said he understood. He said he wanted to fix things. Julia looked at him carefully. She said fixing things required naming them first. She said she did not know who he really was, and she did not want to keep guessing. David promised he would explain everything soon. He said he needed one more chance. He said there were things she deserved to hear properly. Julia considered this. She said one more conversation was fair. She said one more lie was not. They agreed to meet the following evening. That night, Julia could not sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how easily trust could be bent when power went unnamed. She wondered how many times in her life she had been generous only to be weighed for it. Across the city, David prepared. He set aside the jacket he usually wore. He drafted messages and deleted them. He thought about the version of himself he presented to the world and the version he had hidden from Julia. For the first time, the test felt small, inadequate. The next evening, Julia arrived at the meeting place first. It was a quiet restaurant, modest but well kept. She chose a table near the window. When David arrived, he looked different again. Straighter, more deliberate. He did not sit immediately. He told her there were things she needed to know before the conversation went any further. He told her the story he had shared was incomplete. He told her he had not been unemployed. He told her he had not been searching for opportunity. Julia felt her chest tighten, but she stayed still. David took a breath and said his name carried weight in certain rooms. He said money changed the way people listened. He said he had wanted to meet someone without that noise. Julia leaned back slightly. She said wanting simplicity did not excuse deception. David nodded. He said he knew that now. What he had not said yet was how much truth remained. And Julia, watching him closely, knew this moment would decide everything. David sat down slowly, as if the chair required permission. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The restaurant noise filled the space between them. Forks against plates, low conversation, the soft hiss of the espresso machine. Julia kept her hands folded in her lap. She did not look away. David began with facts. He said he was the founder and chief executive officer of a technology company headquartered downtown. He said the building Julia had driven him to was not a contractor interview. It was his own office. He said the networking event was not a favor ticket, it was his world. Julia listened. Her face did not change. David continued. He said he had learned, over years of wealth and influence, that people treated him differently once they knew. He said, kindness became performance. Loyalty became negotiation. He said he wanted something real, unfiltered by status. Julia finally spoke. She said wanting something real did not give him the right to manipulate the conditions. She said he had not simply hidden money. He had designed situations. He had asked questions with answers in mind. He had created tests she never agreed to take. David tried to explain. He said he never meant to hurt her. He said he admired her consistency, her boundaries, her refusal to be impressed. Julia stopped him gently. She said admiration was not the issue. Power was. She said when one person knew the truth and the other did not, the relationship was not equal. She said every choice she made had been informed by incomplete information. She said she had paid for dinners and given rides and opened parts of her life because she believed they were standing on the same ground. David said he understood. He said he had been wrong. Julia looked at him steadily and said this was not a test. It was disrespect. The word landed clean and final. David nodded. Once. He did not argue. She said she did not regret being kind. She said kindness was who she was, not something she offered conditionally. But she did regret being observed like a subject, instead of met like a partner. David asked her what he could do to make it right. Julia thought for a long moment. Then she said there was nothing he could do tonight. She said, accountability did not mean fixing. It meant accepting the outcome. She stood up. David asked if this was goodbye. Julia said it was a boundary. She said if he wanted to be part of her life, it would only be as himself, fully and honestly, without tests, without lessons, without silent scorecards. She said he would have to let go of control, even if that meant losing her. David did not reach for her. He did not stop her. He watched as she walked out of the restaurant and into the night, shoulders straight, steps steady. For the first time, the silence he felt was not strategic. It was earned. At home, Julia cried once. Briefly. Then she washed her face and went to bed. She did not feel broken. She felt clear. Across the city, David stood in his apartment, the lights off, replaying every moment from the beginning. He saw now what he had missed then. He had been measuring integrity while violating it. The test had ended. Not because he chose to stop, but because Julia chose to walk away. David did not contact Julia for several days. Not because he did not want to. Because she had asked for space, and for the first time, he understood that respecting a boundary meant doing nothing at all. He canceled meetings he usually never missed. He walked through his apartment at night without turning on the lights, listening to the city hum below, realizing how quiet power felt when it was stripped of purpose. At work, something shifted. David called a meeting with his executive team and told them he was ending a long-standing internal practice. No more informal evaluations of character disguised as curiosity, no more quiet observations used as leverage. He said trust would no longer be treated like a resource to extract. Some people looked confused. One looked uncomfortable. David did not explain further. He did not say her name. Instead, he made decisions that cost him convenience. He reassigned a senior advisor who had once praised him for being calculated. He stepped away from a partnership that relied on manipulating appearances. These choices did not make headlines. They did not feel dramatic, but they felt necessary. One afternoon, David returned to the cafe where he had first met Julia. He did not go inside. He stood across the street, watching people come and go, remembering how easily he had blended in when no one knew who he was. He understood now that anonymity had never been the problem. Control had been. Julia, meanwhile, focused on rebuilding her routines. She picked up an extra shift. She started walking home a different route, one with more light and fewer memories. She talked with a coworker about applying for a better position. She did not mention David. When his name crossed her mind, it came with clarity instead of ache. 2 weeks later, Julia received an envelope at her apartment. There was no logo. No expensive stationery. Inside was a single page. David had written a letter. Not to persuade. Not to explain. To acknowledge. He wrote that he had crossed a line. That he had mistaken caution for wisdom and power for protection. He wrote that her decision to walk away had forced him to confront a version of himself he had avoided for years. He wrote that he did not expect forgiveness, and he would not ask for it. At the bottom, he added one sentence. If she ever chose to speak with him again, it would be on her terms, with no conditions. Julia read the letter once. Then again, she did not feel relief. She felt something quieter. Recognition. She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. She did not respond. David waited. For the first time in his life, waiting was not strategic. It was honest. Days passed. Then more. When Julia finally saw him again, it was unplanned. They crossed paths at a neighborhood market on a Saturday morning. No warning, no preparation. David looked surprised. Then he stepped back, creating space. Julia nodded. She said hello. They spoke briefly. About the weather. About the produce. About nothing that mattered and everything that did. David did not apologize again. He did not explain. He simply listened. As they parted, Julia said she appreciated the letter. She said change was something she believed in when it was lived, not promised. David said he understood. They walked in opposite directions. This time, neither felt watched. The power had shifted, and for the first time since they met, the ground beneath them felt honest. Weeks passed without ceremony. No dramatic gestures. No sudden appearances. David kept his distance, not as a tactic, but as a practice. He learned the shape of restraint, how it felt to choose inaction when every instinct told him to intervene. He focused on work that did not center him. He funded a community program anonymously. He declined interviews. He stopped being visible on purpose. Julia noticed the change before she understood it. A coworker mentioned a new grant that helped local cafes offer paid training for staff who wanted to move into management. The paperwork was simple. The requirements were reasonable. No branding. No founder speech. Julia applied without thinking much about it. She was accepted. The training took place on weekends in a borrowed classroom above a library. The instructor was practical, patient, unassuming. Julia learned how to read profit and loss statements, how to negotiate schedules, how to advocate for herself without apology. For the first time in a long while, her future felt wider than her exhaustion. One afternoon, after a session ran long, Julia walked out to find David standing across the street. He did not approach. He waited. She crossed to him instead. David told her he had nothing to ask. He said he only wanted to tell her something directly, without intermediaries. He said the program she was attending existed because people like her were always being asked to prove themselves twice. He said he had funded it quietly, then stepped away. Julia listened. She searched his face for expectation. There was none. She asked him why. He told her no. He said transparency mattered more than credit. He said she deserved to know where support came from so she could decide how to feel about it. Julia nodded slowly. She said helping without strings was different from testing. She said this felt different. David said it was. They walked a few blocks together, not like before, slower, with space between their words. David did not fill the silence. Julia did not feel pressured to. She told him about the training, about her goals, about the kind of work environment she wanted to build someday. David listened without offering solutions. He did not interrupt. He did not advise. When they reached her building, Julia stopped. She said she was not ready to start something again. She said trust did not reset on a timeline. It rebuilt through repetition. David agreed. He said if they spoke again, it would be because she chose to, not because he waited well. Julia smiled, just slightly. She said she appreciated the honesty. As David walked away, he felt something unfamiliar. Not triumph. Not relief. Something steadier. He had acted without leverage, and the world had not ended. That night, Julia opened the drawer where she had placed his letter weeks earlier. She read it once more. Then she closed the drawer without putting it back. The next morning, she sent him a message. She thanked him for the program. She said it had helped. She said she was open to a conversation sometime soon, in a public place, with no expectations attached. David read the message twice. He responded simply. He said whenever she was ready. No tests. No conditions. Just truth. Finally offered without disguise. Julia chose the place. A quiet cafe near the river, open windows, wooden tables worn smooth by years of use. Neutral ground. Honest ground. When David arrived, she was already seated, a cup of coffee in front of her, untouched. They greeted each other without ceremony. This time, there was no tension in the air, no invisible scale waiting to tip. They spoke slowly, carefully, not because they were afraid, but because they understood what care meant now. David did not talk about work unless Julia asked. He did not reference the past unless it was necessary. When he did, he named his mistakes plainly. He said he had confused insight with entitlement. He said losing her trust had forced him to confront the way power had shaped his instincts. He said change had not been a moment. It had been a practice. Julia listened. She did not interrupt. She did not rush to reassure him. When it was her turn, she spoke about what the last weeks had given her. Clarity, direction, the realization that she had always known her worth. Even when others tried to measure it, she said walking away had not been easy, but it had been right. David nodded. She told him she was not afraid of wealth or influence. She was afraid of imbalance. She said love could not grow where one person held all the information. She said she needed transparency, not protection. David agreed. He said if they tried again, it would be without disguises, without lessons hidden inside conversations, without tests disguised as curiosity. He said he would meet her where she stood, not observe her from a distance. Julia considered this. She did not give him an answer right away. They met again the following week. Then again after that. Sometimes they talked for hours. Sometimes they simply walked. David showed up as himself, openly, consistently. Julia watched not for perfection, but for alignment. Slowly, something steadier replaced what they had lost. Months later, the training program ended. Julia accepted a new role managing a cafe not far from her old one. On her first day, David stopped by, unannounced but welcome. He ordered coffee. He paid. He thanked her for her time. When she joined him during her break, he reached into his pocket and placed something on the table. It was a folded bill. The first one she had ever used to pay for him. He said he had kept it as a reminder, not of her kindness, but of the moment he realized kindness was not something to test. It was something to honor. Julia smiled. She pushed the bill back toward him and said reminders belonged to the person who needed them most. Later that evening, as the sun lowered over the river, David asked her a question, not a challenge, not a condition. He asked if she would choose him, now that everything was known. Julia looked at him for a long moment. Then she said yes. Not because he had changed his status, but because he had changed his stance. They did not announce it. They did not make a spectacle of it. They built quietly, intentionally, with truth as their foundation. And when people later asked how they met, Julia would say something simple. She would say he once called it a test. And she taught him why love never should be. Because real connection does not begin with judgment. It begins with respect.